When my daughter and I began researching the figure of Tomoe Gozen, I expected to find a typical biography of a woman warrior. But the archives of the Genpei War hid something else entirely. On March 11th, 1184, in the Ichi-no-Tani Gorge, an event occurred that I can only describe as a system failure in history. 30,000 elite Taira samurai were certain of their victory, until she descended upon them from the sheer cliffs. Tomoe was not just a soldier, she was an anomaly in a world of iron patriarchy. During our analysis, we encountered a chilling fact. She operated not like a human being, but like a biological weapon with terrifying, almost rhythmic precision. But what truly haunts me as a historian is the finale. In the heart of the slaughter, 30,000 men watched as she literally vanished into the mist, leaving behind nothing but an empty, perfectly tied helmet. Who was she? The greatest warrior of her age? Or a demon who still causes the river to run crimson? Today, I will share our findings on how one woman became the Empire's eternal nightmare. On the 11th of March, 1184, the narrow gorge of Ichi-no-Tani transformed into a gargantuan death trap, where the brine of the inland sea collided with the suffocating, cloying scent of crushed cherry blossoms. 30,000 warriors of the Taira clan stood with backs to the cliffs, their faces etched with a lethal confidence, believing the jagged rocks behind them were a fortress wall that no human could ever scale. They were wrong. The silence of the morning was shattered by a sound that made the marrow in their bones turn to ice. A thunderous, impossible roar of sliding shale and screaming horses. Down a vertical incline that should have been impassable even for a mountain goat, the vanguard of the Minamoto came screaming like a literal avalanche of steel. At the absolute tip of this suicidal descent, mounted on a stallion as white as a funeral shroud, was Tomoe Gozen, her long black hair whipped behind her like a tattered mourning banner. A dark omen of the harvest of souls that was about to begin. She was not just a soldier, she was an anomaly, a female commander in a world of iron-fisted patriarchy. And she was about to do something so profound that history books would try to sanitize it for centuries. The Taira archers did not even have time to notch their arrows before she hit the valley floor with the force of a falling star. Within the first 60 seconds of impact, the air was no longer filled with the scent of spring, but with the cold finality of drawn steel. Tomoe did not fight with the measured discipline of a scholar. She fought with a primal, rhythmic savagery that suggested she was less a woman and more a force of nature wearing a human mask. Every swing of her blade did not just strike, it erased. While the Taira generals struggled to process the sheer mathematical impossibility of a cavalry charge coming from the clouds, Tomoe was already 10 ranks deep into their elite guard. She moved through the terrified ranks like a sickle through dry wheat, her twin blades flickering in the dim light of the gorge with a speed that defied the naked eye. This was not warfare as the 12th century understood it. This was a reaping conducted by a singular artist of destruction. As the dust from the rock slide began to settle, mixing with the rising smoke of burning pavilions, the 30,000 defenders realized with a sickening jolt of adrenaline that they were not being attacked by an army. They were being hunted by a ghost who refused to die. The terror was infectious. It spread through the Taira lines faster than the fire, as men began to whisper that the white horse carried not a warrior, but an oni, a demon, conjured from the darkest depths of the mountains, to settle an ancient blood debt. But the most bone-chilling detail, the one that would haunt the few survivors for the rest of their short lives, was not the chaos or the speed. It was her face. As she waded into a sea of 30,000 enemies, there was no sweat on her brow, no snarl of exertion, and absolutely no flicker of human rage. Her eyes were wide, clear, and terrifyingly vacant, reflecting a cold, hollow resolve that suggested she had walked past the threshold of the living long before the first horn sounded. She was a ghost inhabiting a masterpiece of flesh, a living weapon that felt no pain, no heat, and no hesitation. The shocking truth was becoming undeniable. This was not a duel, and it was not a skirmish. It was a systematic unraveling of the Taira command. To look at her was to look at the end of an era, a shimmering, crimson-stained omen that the age of the Taira was not just ending, but being violently erased by a lone woman with black hair and a heart made of winter. The moment the hooves of her stallion struck the earth of the valley floor, the world erupted in a cacophony of snapping impacts and the shrieking of rending iron. Tomoe Gozen did not simply enter the battle. She became a living vortex of absolute destruction, a singular point of lethality around which the entire fate of the Taira clan began to unravel. While the rank-and-file samurai stood frozen, their minds failing to comprehend the sheer audacity of a descent that should have pulverized every bone in a horse's body. Tomoe was already carving a cavernous void through their front lines. She moved with a terrifying liquid grace that felt fundamentally wrong to the human eye, shifting her weight and her blades with a precision that bypassed the need for conscious thought. The air around her did not just vibrate with the sound of combat. It hummed with the whistling of her twin katanas. Moving so fast they left silver trails in the humid, smoke-filled air. Before the first enemy general could even shift his grip on his lacquered scabbard, Tomoe's blade had already completed its arc. In a single, sickeningly smooth motion, his challenge was answered and his life was forfeit. The fall of his banner a grotesque contrast against the delicate, pale pink cherry blossoms that carpeted the ground. What had been a serene imperial garden moments ago was instantly transformed into the threshold of a screaming hell. The sheer physical toll of such combat would have collapsed any other warrior. Yet Tomoe's breathing remained slow and rhythmic, her stamina seemingly fueled by a source that defied the laws of biology. It was as if the more lives she extinguished, the more vibrant her own unnatural energy became. The battlefield had become her temple, and every fallen warrior was an offering to a god of war that the history books were too afraid to name. By high noon, the valley of Ichi-no-Tani had ceased to be a tactical battlefield and had devolved into a primal, uncontrollable slaughterhouse. The crystalline air of the morning was gone, replaced by a suffocating ochre shroud, where the grit of pulverized limestone from the earlier rock slides swirled into the greasy, black soot of burning funeral pyres, effectively blotting out the sun. In this artificial twilight, the silhouettes of the dying moved like shadow puppets against a backdrop of fire. It was during this hour that the Taira command, desperate to stem the tide of their disintegrating morale, unleashed their final hope. 7 of the most renowned warriors in the empire, men whose names were whispered with reverence in every dojo from Heian-kyo to the outer provinces. These were the 7 of the Iron Gate, masters of the spear and the longsword who had never known the sting of defeat. One by one, they stepped forward to challenge the lone woman on the white horse, and one by one, they were deleted from existence. The efficiency of their demise was nothing short of supernatural. Each legendary champion fell faster than the one who preceded him, as if Tomoe were not merely fighting them, but harvesting their very life force, siphoning their vitality into the gleaming edge of her katanas. The first warrior, a giant of a man famous for his ability to snap a spear shaft with his bare hands, was simply undone, his challenge ending before it had even echoed off the canyon walls. The second and third, brothers who fought with a synchronized precision that had defeated entire platoons, found their perfect rhythm broken by a silver flash, their forms collapsing to the earth before they could even draw their breaths to scream. By the time the seventh warrior fell, his heavy, iron-studded armor split clean down the center as if it were made of wet silk. A profound and paralyzing silence rippled through the Taira ranks. This was the moment the logic of the soldier died and the hysteria of the damned took its place. The thousands of men watching from the ridges began to tremble, a viral whisper snaking through the lines, carrying a terrifying new realization. They were not facing a mortal woman, nor even a gifted samurai. They were convinced they were looking at an ancient Oni, a demoness of the high peaks who had donned the exquisite mask of a beauty to lure the pride of the Taira into a trap of eternal ruin. Then, she did the one thing that broke the last remnants of their spirit. She spoke. Her voice, amplified by the natural acoustics of the gorge and something far more ancient, rose above the deafening roar of the battle. It was a sound that did not seem to come from human vocal cords, but from the earth itself, a resonant, bone-shaking command that bypassed the ears and struck directly at the primal centers of the brain. It was a war cry that carried the weight of 1,000 ancestors. A sonic shockwave that caused hardened veterans to drop their weapons in a state of superstitious paralysis. Men who had survived a dozen campaigns fell to their knees, their hands shaking with a palsy they could not control. The Taira were no longer an army. They were a herd of frightened animals waiting for the wolf. The air grew cold, despite the fires, and the smell of ozone began to mix with the scent of ruin. Tomoe steered her horse forward, the animal's white coat now stained deep, bruised purple in the twilight of the gorge, and as she moved, the 30,000 warriors of the Taira recoiled as one, a massive, heaving wave of humanity, desperate to put distance between themselves and the creature in the center of the clearing. They were witnessing the birth of a legend, but for them, it was only the beginning of a nightmare that would never truly end. At the precise moment when the strategic geometry of the battlefield seemed to turn into a definitive death sentence, the environment itself began to rebel against the laws of nature. The sheer weight of 30,000 Taira warriors had finally begun to exert its gravity. A massive, grinding ring of steel and desperate men slowly tightening around the Minamoto vanguard, intent on crushing the life out of the rebellion by sheer numerical mass. But as the gap closed to less than 50 yards, a sudden, unnatural atmospheric shift paralyzed every man on the field. From the direction of the Iharagawa River, a fog rolled in. Not the thin, drifting mist of a spring morning, but a thick, glacial and terrifyingly opaque wall of white vapor that felt as heavy as a wet funeral shroud. It did not drift, it surged, devouring the light and the warmth of the valley in a matter of heartbeats. In the center of this burgeoning void stood Tomoe Gozen, a figure now so saturated in the echoes of the fight that her lacquered armor had lost its original color, gleaming instead with a wet, obsidian crimson that seemed to pulse in the dying light. She looked up at the sky, which was already obscured by the greasy black plumes of funeral pyres and the encroaching mist, and she raised both of her katanas toward the heavens in a final, defiant salute to the gods of war. Then she let out a cry, a sound so primal, so resonant, and so utterly devoid of human restraint that the very cliffs of Ichi-no-Tani seemed to groan in response. It was a sonic explosion that vibrated in the marrow of every soldier's teeth, a frequency of pure, unadulterated fury that caused the charging Taira front ranks to stumble as if the ground itself had turned to liquid. Driven by a mixture of ancestral pride and the raw, animal instinct to eliminate the source of their terror, the Taira commanders screamed the order to close the distance. Thousands of men threw themselves forward in a frenzied mass, a tidal wave of spears and blades plunging into the heart of the fog, aiming for the spot where the white horse and the demon woman had been standing only seconds before. The sound of the collision was deafening, the clang of steel on steel, the thud of bodies hitting bodies, and the screams of men caught in the blinding whiteout, their own comrades becoming phantoms in the chaos. For several agonizing minutes, the center of the valley was a chaotic, sightless blender of violence, a churning pit of iron and madness where 30,000 men fought an invisible enemy. But then, as abruptly as it had arrived, the wind shifted. The cold breath of the Iharagawa River swept the mist away, and the dust of the crumbling cliffs finally began to settle. The Taira warriors pulled back, gasping for air, their blades held high, expecting to see the mangled remains of the woman who had defied them. Instead, they were met with a sight that shattered the collective sanity of the army. There was no body. There was no white horse. There was not even a single trace of recent struggle on the patch of earth where she had made her stand. In the exact center of the scorched, trampled clearing, resting perfectly upright on the dirt, sat her empty helmet. Its silk cords were neatly tied, its golden crest catching the last dying rays of the sun, looking as if it had been placed there with the deliberate care of a priest at an altar. Surrounded by a wall of 30,000 armed men who had watched her every move, the greatest warrior of the age had simply ceased to exist in the physical realm. There were no hoofprints leading away from the site, no gap in the human circle through which she could have fled, and no possible concealment in the flat, slick mud. She had vanished into the ether, leaving behind a vacuum of silence that was more terrifying than the loudest war cry. The psychological impact was instantaneous and devastating. The Taira samurai, men who feared no mortal foe, found themselves staring into a metaphysical abyss. The realization that they had been fighting something that could discard its physical form at will sent a shockwave of superstitious dread through the ranks. Some men simply dropped their swords and began to weep, while others stared at the empty helmet with wide, unblinking eyes, their minds breaking under the weight of the impossible. They were not just losing a battle, they were being haunted in real time. The Gorge of Ichi-no-Tani, once a strategic stronghold, had become a haunted cathedral of the dead, and the Taira were the unwilling congregation. As the shadows lengthened, the 30,000 soldiers began to realize that though Tomoe was gone, her presence had never been more suffocating. She had left them alone with the void, alone with the mountain of fallen warriors she had created, and alone with a growing, parasitic madness that suggested the true conflict was far from over. The empty helmet sat there like a silent judge, a mocking reminder that while they possessed the numbers, she possessed their souls. The wind began to howl through the narrow cracks in the cliffs, and to the ears of the damned it sounded exactly like the dying echo of her final, bone-chilling scream. The search for the body of Tomoe Gozen began as a military necessity, but rapidly spiraled into a desperate, ritualistic obsession that consumed the psyche of the Taira survivors. Every single square inch of the Ichi-no-Tani Gorge was subjected to a frantic, clawing interrogation. The earth was literally overturned, the mud sieved through trembling fingers, and the mountains of the fallen were unpiled and spread across the slick valley floor. This was no longer a battlefield. It was a vast, open-air tomb, and the living were forced to play the role of desecrators, their hands searching for a ghost among the empty vessels of their comrades. The sun beat down on their backs, but they felt no warmth, only a draining, oppressive weight. The work was grimly silent, punctuated by the wet slap of mud and the occasional, choked sob of a soldier who recognized a face among the fallen. With each passing hour, the futility of the task became a palpable entity, a mocking presence that whispered in the wind. They were not searching for a fallen warrior. They were performing a penance, a maddening ritual demanded by an unseen power. The silence of the gorge became an active, listening presence, a heavy blanket that smothered the sounds of their frantic work, making every scrape of a shovel and every muttered curse sound like a sacrilege. But the lack of a physical form provided no relief. Instead, it birthed a psychological epidemic that was more lethal than any plague. Within the encampment of the survivors, a quiet and terrible phenomenon began to spread like a wildfire in a drought. Seasoned warriors, men who had stared down their own mortality for decades, were found in the grey light of dawn, having answered a final, silent command, their weapons lying beside them as if in offering. The few who were stopped before the final act, their eyes wide with a terror that had no earthly source, told stories that made the skin of the listeners crawl with primeval dread. They claimed that the ambient noise of the Iharagawa River had changed its frequency, that the rhythmic churning of the water over the stones had transformed into a distinct female voice, a melodic yet terrifying rasp that whispered their secret names, spoke of forgotten shames from battles long past, of moments of cowardice no one could have known, and commanded them to join her in the lightless depths of the afterlife. The sound was pervasive, bypassing the walls of tents and the plugging of ears, vibrating through the very soles of their feet until it felt like it was originating from inside their own skulls. It was a deeply personal torment, tailored to each man's soul. To the proud, it whispered of their failure. To the fearful, it promised an end to the terror. To the loyal, it spoke of rejoining their fallen lords. The impulse to obey became the only way to silence the siren call. Panic, cold and sharp as a winter blade, replaced the iron discipline of the clan. Desertion became the only thought, yet the geography that had once been their shield had now become their cage. The cliffs were too steep to climb, the Minamoto controlled the land route, and the sea, once their dominion, was now a terrifying, unknown void. Those desperate enough to attempt an escape through the churning waters of the Iharagawa River found that the river was no longer a path, but a predator. Small groups of soldiers would band together in the dead of night, whispering prayers and promises to each other before plunging into the currents under the cover of darkness. Their comrades on the bank would wait, holding their breath, listening for a splash, a cry, anything. But there was only silence. The men would simply vanish, as if the water had simply opened up and swallowed them whole, leaving not even a ripple on its dark surface. By the following mornings, the tides would deposit these men back onto the banks, their bodies perfectly intact, their armor unmarred. There was no physical sign of struggle, no water in their lungs, yet their faces were frozen in masks of such unutterable, otherworldly horror that their own comrades refused to touch them. They would be left where they lay, the rising sun casting long shadows from their rigid forms. A silent, terrified pact was formed among the survivors. The river was forbidden. It was no longer water, it was her. The discovery of these returned men cemented the supernatural truth in their minds, transforming abstract fear into cold, hard certainty. They were not merely defeated, they were cursed. The legend of the demon woman had effectively transitioned from a rumor of the battlefield into a sentient, living nightmare that paralyzed the remnants of the once great army with a surgical efficiency. The Taira were no longer an organized military force. They were a collection of ghosts in waiting, trapped in a gorge that felt increasingly like a waiting room for hell. No arrows were fired, No swords were swung, and no grand strategies were debated in the command tents. The very structure of their clan was dissolving. In one tent, a famed general, a man who had advised emperors, sat for days on end, meticulously polishing the blade of his sword, his eyes never leaving the steel as if he were watching a story unfold within its reflection. In another, a group of officers had abandoned all pretense of command, engaging in a silent, desperate game of Go, the stones clicking with a hollow finality in the oppressive quiet. Their maps were rolled up and tied, useless relics of a war that was no longer fought on land. How could one strategize against a sound? How could one fight a river? The air was filled with the low, continuous chanting of prayers that provided no protection, and the hollow, rhythmic thud of men striking their heads against the stones to stop the whispering. The strategic reality was staggering. An army of nearly 30,000 had been rendered combat ineffective not by a superior force, but by the sheer, crushing weight of a supernatural trauma. The presence of Tomoe Gozen had become a parasitic entity, feeding on their guilt, their pride, and their marrow, proving that in the theatre of war, the most devastating weapon is not made of steel, but of the terrifying realization that you are being hunted by something that cannot be defeated because it was never truly alive. The empty helmet in the center of the clearing became the focal point of their collective madness. Superstitions bloomed around it like poisonous flowers. It was said that the helmet would turn to face any man who was about to take his own life. It was whispered that at midnight, a faint, cold light would emanate from within its empty visor. A young, terrified soldier, driven by a drunken dare, once tried to kick it over, only to freeze mid-stride, his body locked in a rigid paralysis until his comrades dragged his screaming, unblinking form away. It was no longer an object of war. It was an idol to their despair, a silent judge presiding over their slow, inevitable decay. The Iharagawa River continued to flow, its roar growing louder with every sunset, carrying the echoes of 1,000 final moments that had yet to be uttered, while the empty helmet remained as a silent sentinel of their impending inevitable annihilation. The tragic finality of this saga did not reveal its full, soul-chilling scope until many years had passed. Long after the fires of the Genpei War had cooled into the grey ash of history, and the names of the Taira generals had been eroded from their headstones by the indifferent wind and rain. For decades, the Gorge of Ichi-no-Tani was avoided as a cursed place, a geographic scar where the very air felt heavy with an unspoken sorrow. It was given a name by the surrounding provinces, the Silent Gorge, not because it was quiet, the wind and river were ever present, but because it was a place that had silenced 30,000 men, and its own silence in return was an active, listening presence. Travelers would take long, arduous detours through the mountains rather than pass through the valley, claiming that the wind there never sounded quite right, that it carried a thin, keening note that scraped against the soul. The birds, it was said, refused to sing in the trees that grew on its slopes, and animals would not drink from the river that carved its path to the sea. A local lord in the 15th century, seeking to reclaim the fertile valley land, ordered a small shrine built to appease whatever spirits lingered there. The shrine was washed away in a flash flood on a perfectly clear day, leaving behind not a single splinter of wood. The message was understood. It was a place where memory had become a tangible, oppressive force, a wound on the landscape that refused to heal. But time erodes even the most potent fears, and as generations passed, local villagers eventually returned to the shadows of the cliffs, rebuilding their lives on the edge of a forgotten nightmare. It was they, the humble farmers and fishermen, who became the unwilling chroniclers of a terror that history had failed to record. they began to document a terrifying rhythmic pattern in the behavior of the Iharagawa River, a phenomenon that defied every law of nature and theology. They realized that the river was not merely a body of water, but a vast, liquid lung, breathing in synchronization with a massacre that refused to end. Every year, during the precise window when the cherry blossoms reach their peak and begin their slow, fluttering descent like snow made of flesh, the transformation begins. It starts subtly. The water, normally clear and swift, seems to slow, to grow heavy and lethargic, as if weighed down by an unseen burden. Then, the first threads of colour appear in the current, thin crimson tendrils snaking through the water like veins. Within hours, these threads bleed outward. And when the spring storms roll in from the sea to batter the jagged teeth of the Ichi-no-Tani cliffs, the water of the Iharagawa does not turn muddy or grey as a normal river should. Instead, it thickens, turning a deep, visceral shade of crimson, flowing with the unmistakable viscosity of something other than water. Scientists and skeptics have tried for a century to explain it away. In the Meiji era, a famed engineer from Tokyo, Ishikawa, publicly mocked the local legends as feudal nonsense and declared he would tame the peasant superstitions by building a modern weir. His project was plagued by inexplicable accidents. Tools would vanish, foundations would crack overnight, and his workers, hardened men of industry, would complain of unending nightmares and a constant, whispering voice that followed them from the riverbank. After a sudden flash flood, on a clear, cloudless day, destroyed 3 months of work, the project was abandoned. Ishikawa was found a week later, sitting on the riverbank, staring into the water, his hair having turned completely white. He never spoke another coherent word for the rest of his life. Modern geologists still publish papers blaming mineral runoff, while biologists propose theories of a rare algae. But the locals know the truth the instruments cannot measure. They leave offerings of white flowers on the banks, not in worship, but in appeasement. They know that the river is not carrying sediment, it is carrying a memory, and from the churning, red depths of the rapids, a sound rises that can strip the sanity from an unprepared mind, a piercing, multi-tonal war cry that carries the unmistakable, jagged edge of Tomoe Gozen's voice. It is a sound that repeats and refracts, echoing in every single drop of rain that falls upon the valley, as if the very atmosphere has memorized her fury and is forced to replay it for eternity. But the true, sickening horror of this legend lies in the realization that Tomoe never actually died on that field, nor did she escape to live out her days in the quiet anonymity of a convent. The shocking reality is that she became an intrinsic, sentient part of the land itself, a tectonic spirit of vengeance that fused her essence with the rocks, the silt, and the foam of the gorge. Her spirit was the steel, the battle was the fire, and the river was the quenching pool that forged her into something eternal. She did not simply haunt the place, she became the place. The empty helmet was not a relic she left behind, it was the anchor point of her transformation, the vessel through which she poured her undying will into the very bedrock of Japan. She evolved into an eternal guardian, a metaphysical trap set for the arrogant and the proud. Even today, 800 years later, the Iharagawa River remains a predatory sight. Modern tourists, amateur historians, and glory seekers who walk the banks of the river during the blossoming season often report a sudden, inexplicable drop in temperature that feels like a blade pressed against the throat. They speak of a thick, localized mist that rises from the water, smelling not of the sea, but of ancient incense and wet iron. And within that mist, for a fraction of a second, they see the impossible, the flash of raven-black hair whipping through the air, and the cold, surgical glint of twin katanas moving with the speed of a lightning strike. In 1998, a team of paranormal investigators from Osaka set up sensitive audio equipment along the riverbank. They recorded nothing but the sound of rushing water for 2 days. On the 3rd day, during a sudden downpour, their equipment captured a sound that caused their digital recorders to glitch and their analog tapes to physically warp. The lead investigator, a man named Takeda, later wrote in his journal, "It is not a sound. It is a presence that uses sound as a vehicle." Listening to the playback felt like having a needle of ice pushed slowly into my brain. We have captured nothing but our own insignificance. The team dismantled their camp that very night and never returned. In 2012, a young travel blogger from America disappeared near the gorge during the blossom season. The last post on his social media was a photo of the river, its waters a disturbing shade of red. The caption read, "The river here is incredible." And the weirdest thing, I think I can hear someone singing. His phone was found on the riverbank the next day, perfectly dry, its battery still full. He was never seen again. Those who are unlucky enough to be caught in the river's crimson embrace during a storm are never seen again in the world of the living. Their disappearance is always the same. No struggle, no debris, just a sudden vacuum where a human being once stood. They are drawn down into the cold, crushing silence of the riverbed, their lungs filled not with water, but with an ancient, echoing rage. Their consciousness is flayed, layer by layer, their individuality dissolved into a collective of eternal servitude. They are pulled down to join the 30,000 Taira warriors who still march in the dark, their penance never ending, serving as the eternal footstools for a queen who refused to be conquered by time or death. Tomoe Gozen proved that while empires are built on paper and stone, true power is built on a will so violent it can stain the water for 1,000 years. She remains there beneath the surface, a shimmering omen of what happens when a human being decides to become a nightmare.